Hello, world singers. My name is Brooke.
And I'm Tyler.
And this is Cosmere Conversations.
Hello, all of you lovely listeners. We have a true treat tonight. One, we're recording at night, which is always fun. And two,
different vibe.
It's definitely a different vibe. And even more so, the vibes have shifted because we have a very special guest this evening. Joshua, you may know him as Jofwu from Reddit, a long-time Cosmere companion, a long-time Arcanist, and fan of the Cosmere that has been contributing in more ways than we could possibly go over this evening, has graced us with his presence. And we are going to be talking about cognitive shadows. I want to say, Joshua, thank you so much for joining us. It is wonderful to have you here, and welcome to Cosmere Conversations.
Thank you so much, both for having me and for changing your usual scheduled time for the podcast. So yeah, I'm excited.
It's lovely to have the evening experience, just like the late night panels.
Cosmere After Dark.
Yeah, exactly. When it happens at Dragonsteel, we always think it's good vibes there. And I'm excited to talk about some ghostly artifacts of the Cosmere this late in the evening. I think it will all go together real nicely. As I mentioned up front, you're known as Jofwu across the internet. Do you have a TikTok or any other socials that you would quickly like to shout out? Where can the people follow you if they so do desire?
You know, I do have a TikTok, Jofwu17. I don't use it a ton. I have an Instagram by the same name, which I use even less. So, but they exist. You can follow me there. Yeah, I mainly spend my time on Reddit and 17th Shard.
The classics as they were, and I think that anyone who has spent any amount of time over on the 17th Shard, in the Arcanum, or on Reddit has noticed your presence. You've been part of the Cosmere community for a really long time. And I'd love to kind of just start us off with, who's your favorite character in the Cosmere? And are you aligned with an order of Knight Radiant?
Yes, my favorite character is Shallan. Maybe a hot take. Most people, she's a little controversial with some people, but I love Shallan. She's Kaladin's great. Dalinar's great. There's some characters in Stormlight that are just, they're crowd pleasers, and I like them. Shallan keeps me guessing, and it's just, I resonate really well with her a lot of times. So Shallan's my favorite. Always love my time with her. Order of the Knights Radiant, the Truth Watchers is what I get in the test, and I think that's what I most identify with. I feel like a lot of people end up, they're just kind of nerds, and it's like the nerd order, but that's where I am.
I like that. I feel like that kind of aligns with your role as an arcanist and kind of gathering knowledge.
Absolutely. There is kind of that tremendous amount of information. I will at least sing your praises a little bit because we have built several episodes on talking timelines. One, the timeline of Shallan Devar, but also the timeline of the Greater Cosmere, the timeline of Rashar, and trying to put in context so many of the character moments or the plot arcs of specific books. And as a resource, not just for us, but for the interactive map of Rashar and for so many aspects, you long ago created a timeline spreadsheet that has served as the basis of so much work throughout the Cosmere. And so I would be remiss if we didn't take at least a little bit of time to talk about your famous spreadsheet. And if it's not famous, I hope it will long reign as a famous spreadsheet. And could you tell me a little bit about where that project began and how you came about putting everything together in kind of one spot for the entire fandom to eventually end up using and relying on in some way when it comes to like the interactive map?
It was largely because, so I came to Brandon and the Cosmere as a Wheel of Time fan, and somewhere out there on the internet was this Wheel of Time timeline that like had the entire series, like every chapter like plotted out, this is where it was. And Wheel of Time uses like an Earth calendar, and so it was kind of like, here's like the day of the, you know, of the year that it happens on. So I just thought that was really cool. And so when I started reading Stormlight, Words of Radiance. Someone had put together like a timeline of Words of Radiance because you could track the days pretty well in that book. But that wasn't done for like the rest of the series. And I just thought it would be fun to to try and go through and map out the rest.
Did you know at the time, like, what a big project it would be?
I don't think I did. I don't think I did. It was, but that's the kind of nerd I am, right? I'm the Truth Watch thing. So it was, I like spreadsheets. I'm an engineer. I couldn't help myself. So I just started getting into, digging into everything. And I wanted it to be flexible because Brandon writes new books and you get new information that changes the date here or there. And a lot of these dates are like, this thing that's happening is based on when this other thing happened. And so I wanted it to be all like linked together where one thing is based on another thing. It's documented. Here's the number. That's just how I approached it. It was just kind of a fun problem to solve. Yeah. So I went through, created, an entry for everything I wanted on the timeline and linked it to some other event that happened on the timeline with numbers and dates. So it was a big project, but it was fun to do. And I'm glad that so many people have like found a big use out of it.
Yeah, it's such a great resource.
It does continually come up as a valuable resource. And I think part of that is, to your credit, recognizing the changing nature and the investigative nature of so many people in the Cosmere fandom. But the real strength I see in that is the links that you were talking about between events and the depth. Like, it is very easy to get a casual look and kind of just scroll down the timeline and see like, oh, this is kind of how things go in order. But then you do have links, and that's where the astounding amount of depth comes in, because you're often citing chapter and verse and providing evidence. This has even developed further because you did a revamp a little bit after Wind and Truth. So could you just tell us about some of those changes between the earlier version and what you've done lately?
Yeah, this is like, I hope this is exciting for people. I had it all like it originally was all in like a Google sheet, and it started getting a little bit slow. Like there was too much stuff in it, and it was moving really slow whenever you wanted to change something or just move around in the sheet. So I moved it all to a database, to an Access database, and did that for a while. And I just sort of copied the output of the database into the timeline part that people needed to interact with. And I wasn't happy with that because the database ended up not working some things the way I wanted it to. It wasn't, some events are like based on more than one other event, and that wasn't working very well. I sort of was doing it just to like explore and learn a little bit about databases while I was playing with it. So I was able to fix that. And I found some ways to make it run better, just entirely in the spreadsheet. And so I started from scratch and just went in and redid the entire thing. Basically, I didn't go through all the sources because those are like an insane amount of like data that's there. But I did kind of copy it all there and sort of retie everything together, and it works a little bit better now. And it lets me like tie multiple things to multiple other things a lot better than it used to, which I got maybe a little bit too crazy going through and trying to do that to fix some of the dates that were in there to make them more accurate. But yeah, it was a fun project to do.
I can't wait to check out this new and improved timeline.
You mentioned the interactive map that's on there as well. We'll probably update that maybe 6 months to a year after. We give some time after the new book comes out to like update that, and it's a big undertaking to update that. But looking forward to when we can update that, because I think the map is like a really cool way to work with the timeline. It's not as much detail that's in it, but it's just it's a more fun way to look at the information, I think.
Yeah, definitely. For people who, when you look at a spreadsheet, your eyes go cross-eyed. Like, you can look at a visually pleasing map instead.
Yeah, the map is obviously the fancy marketing. That's what brings in all the eyes. But it's truly the spreadsheet underneath it all that makes everything work. And I was curious, just checking out, maybe you've always had this, but there's a confidence interval column on the spreadsheet. Could you talk about just like a little bit your thinking behind what's the confidence interval makeup, and what does that indicate on each individual point that you have labeled in there?
There's two things that I think you could mix that up with. On every date, I have like a range of dates. Like there's like a negative end and a positive end on what the date is. And then there's also the confidence thing, and they're a little bit tied together, but they're a little bit separate. So when I do the dates, we were actually having a conversation about are we doing full spoilers?
Yes, 100%.
Talk wind of truth.
I guess that is should always be an announcement. Yeah, this is hashtag all spoilers. We're going to go as far as possible when we eventually start talking about cognitive shadows. But if you want to bring up the wind and truth stuff now, you are free to do so.
We're having a conversation on Discord earlier today, actually. Someone was talking about like, oh, Gavinor was in the spiritual realm for 20 years. And so when I put something like that in the timeline, I put it's 20 years. But like when somebody says, oh, I moved, to such and such, I moved to this place 20 years ago. They don't mean like 20 years to the day, right? It might mean 18 years ago, and they're rounding up. It might be, it was a little bit more than that. And so I put like a range, plus or minus a couple years on either side, depending on like what the context is and these kinds of things. So there's sort of a range on what I think the date is based on the source data. And then there's also, I kind of attach a confidence with just how confident I am in the assumptions that I'm making that give me those dates. So like if it says very explicitly, and I know like this is the day that this thing happened on, it's not questionable because there's some kind of reason that says this is the day it happened on a light day. Like there's only one light day that happened in this year. That's the day it's on. Whereas something that was, says, oh, it was 20 years ago. It's kind of like a medium, like, okay, it's something in this range. And then on the far end of that is something where I'm just kind of making a very wild guess. Honor says like, oh, the dogs all died out. So, so many years, after sometime after this. And I'm like, oh, I really want to put dogs dying out on the timeline. I did not. So I don't know why I picked that of all the things.
Yeah, it needs to be on there so people know when Rashar started to decline.
I considered putting that on there because I was kind of amused by like that was the detail that Brandon thought was really important for us to know about. But something like that where there's like no like I just can make a wild guess on when this thing happened. If it's something that's important enough to include, then I might like make a wild guess and put it on. So there's sort of the date range on like what I think it's going to be, and then there's also the confidence, which is based on the data. Do I think this is like really accurate, or do I think that I'm making a wild guess on what this is? So that's what those numbers are. Something that probably most people opening the timeline are not have no like I don't know what this is about. They're just looking at the numbers that's right there. But yeah, so I applaud you for being curious about the meaning.
Oh yeah, I mean you said you don't know if this is interesting. I don't care, man. This is the conversation that we get to have, and I'm interested. I think that the spreadsheet, as I said, serving as the basis of so many different aspects of the Cosmere, but most importantly, it is that kind of question that Brandon puts out there as an author of like, how interested do you want to be in all of this stuff? And it was so many of the early readers and the people who were willing to go on Reddit or Discord or things before both Reddit and Discord existed and have these conversations on the forums that would eventually lead to the development of the Coppermind and these like fan databases of so many types and varieties.
Yeah, we're so spoiled as a fandom. And so much of that is thanks to, as you're saying, like the really early fans who just like went all in from the get-go, and then by the time we came into the fandom maybe a few years after that, there was already so much infrastructure we could hit the ground running as true nerds.
Yeah, no, I do love how many like resources there are, especially Coppermind, Arcanum, things like that let people really, I don't know, get in deep and have a fun time with it.
Yeah.
And that's what we really want to do today, and why we wanted to have you on. Who better to talk with when it comes to one of the more challenging concepts in the Cosmere, one of the most debated, certainly one that Brandon gets asked about all the time and has been asked about for years. We're going to be looking at cognitive shadows, and we're going to start up front with the acknowledgement that while we may sound very definitive and we might provide some evidence here and there, this is a topic that Brandon himself is kind of purposefully being a little bit vague on. He often says cognitive shadows are defined this way in world. And as the creator, I am not going to be defining exactly what a cognitive shadow is. So if he is unwilling to give a hard definition, obviously we are not in a position where we will be giving a hard definition, but we're also going to have a spirited debate and a back and forth where our claims are going to be a little bit grander. So just keep in mind that Brandon purposefully kind of talks his way around being definitive on a cognitive shadow, but we do think that there's a lot of evidence from the text as well as words of Brandon over the years that can help us triangulate a little bit. And because going forward in the Cosmere, it seems like cognitive shadows are going to continually be important, I think it's going to really help out if we just take some time and provide as much of a definition as well as evidence as we can. So I hope you're all ready to join the ride, because we're going in pretty hard with this one. And I thank Jofwu for joining us. Brooke, do you think you could start us with just a basic definition of cognitive shadow that we can all work on? And then we'll maybe talk about specific examples as well.
Yeah, I'll give the definition that you and I have kind of been operating on that I think is pretty basic, but I would also love to hear from you, Joshua, if you have kind of your own understanding or definition of what a cognitive shadow is. We have sort of decided for ourselves that a cognitive shadow can be defined as a spirit or soul or cognitive aspect that has not moved on to the beyond due to some kind of expansion.
I like that. I think that's a good definition. I always kind of go to what Zahel says in the chapter with Kaladin in Rhythm of War, where he kind of points to himself. And I love his explanation with the fossil. He brings out the fossil to share with Kaladin. And it's kind of like you had this thing that had this shape, and you packed it with a bunch of investiture, and then the physical matter that was originally there left, but it's been replaced with this something else. And so I like that imagery of what it is. It gets you into that ship of Theseus discussion of is it the real thing or is it not? That comes up a few times in the Cosmere. So I think it's a cool definition.
Yeah, I also love the metaphor of the fossil for this concept. To me, it makes it very clear. And then we do come into this question of, is it the same thing? Is the person who is the cognitive shadow still the same person? Is it a completely different thing? We have so many more questions about this now after Wind and Truth as well. I would say that if it's a fossil, it is not the same thing. It is a completely different thing that has been shaped and molded based on a previous thing. But, if you go to a natural history museum and you see a fossil, that is not the thing. It's not the creature. It's not a bone. It is a different thing. And so I think that's important for us to remember.
Certainly at the Cosmere 401 panel at Dragonsteel Nexus, we talked about cognitive shadows as well as had some audience questions about this ship of Theseus idea. I think in the room, it was maybe 50-50 to 60-40 split, leaning towards a cognitive shadow is not the person, or another way of saying that is not the soul of a person, but it is something different. Let's just get right to the most controversial of topics, Jofwu. How do you fall in that question? The cognitive shadow, is it a different thing entirely or still the original?
I think it's the original. That's where I land. And I think I mostly feel that way just because it's frustrating, storytelling wise, if it's not the original, oh, this is Kelsey, or oh, it's not the real Kelsey, or it's, this thing that's sort of taking his shape. It just feels weird to me. I want it to be the real, the real character that I knew. So there's probably some cases maybe where I'd be okay, maybe this one's different than another. But I think generally I tend to more feel like this is the original character. They've had something come in and sort of expand their soul. They've had something come in and sort of build up with investiture, and part of them has left. But I think what really makes me feel that way, kind of more in a more in-world sense, is that at the end of the day, their souls in this world, their souls are investiture. they might have some kind of more distant beyond, some kind of soul that kind of goes to the beyond, like some kind of more spiritual thing that's going on outside of like the reality of the books, right? But you have the spiritual realm, you have the cognitive realm, you have the physical realm. These things are all like a scientifically like understandable piece of who these people are. And so they have a piece of themselves that exists in a very real sense in the spiritual realm that is made of investiture. So in my mind, like their soul is investiture. You're just sort of giving them more, and part of them has been gone. Part of them has left, but there's still like stuff there that is what they were before. They've just, I'm a human, the carbon that makes up my body is not like the carbon that I was born with. And so I feel like it's the same kind of thing. It's just a matter of investiture instead of matter.
That's very interesting when you're talking about how the carbon in your body is not the same carbon that you were born with, but it is still you. And that's definitely pushing into the ship of Theseus. How many times can you be rebuilt throughout a life and still be considered you? We, as humans in this world, say until you die. Like there's never a point of change. I don't know how many cycles of carbon or just molecules go into keeping a human alive, but certainly we don't draw a line and say like, well, after your fourth cycle, you're no longer you. That wouldn't make any sense at all. And so that's a very strong argument for we'll say remains a soul or remains the original entity side of the equation. Brooke, would you like to bring up one of the words of Brandon that starts way back in 2017 in regards to cognitive shadows as well as Elantrians?
Sure. I guess we should say for the audience as well, some examples of cognitive shadows. Like, what are we talking about when we say cognitive shadows? These would be heralds, fused, the returned, shades on Threnody, Kelsier after he dies, Yumi, nightmares, and Tanavast / the Stormfather, sort of, maybe, kind of weird.
Still the most controversial of ones, of course. What exactly was a Stormfather and Tanavast in Wind and Truth? And
we can't have that full discussion right now.
Not yet, but it's the starting place. We have these kind of entities. And then back in 2017, we had Kyrindor. Don't know if that's the pronunciation. Very sorry if it's mispronounced. Let me know how to pronounce it when you hear this. Ask this question to Brandon.
You've said that returned count as cognitive shadows stapled back onto their bodies, and that the heralds are at least similar. Would I be right in assuming that Elantrians would be considered as cognitive shadows as well, or am I barking up the wrong tree?
Brandon responds, quote, recognize that the term cognitive shadow is an in-Cosmere theory, which I'm not going to comment on as the creator of the setting. The theory is this. A, investiture seeks sapience. It looks for someone to control it, or, in some instances, spontaneously adopts personality.
B, a mind, a cognitive aspect of a person, can become infused with investiture. This acts a little like minerals with petrified wood, replacing the mind and personality with investiture.
C, when the actual person dies, this investiture imprint remains behind, a copy of the soul, but not the actual soul.
D, others disagree with this and think that the soul itself persists. Still others reject the theory in its entirety. End quote.
So right there, I think we have the succinct explanation from Brandon, kind of as far as he's willing to explain, which is, here's the theory. It is not agreed to by everyone in the world, and he is not commenting on it. Jofwu, you've taken one side of the equation. I think Brooke is taking the other side, and I would agree more with that. When Vasher is talking about the way that Type 2 invested entities, kind of a mockery of men, or I think he says they're masquerading as men, that to me is pointing at a little bit more of a performance of a not thing, pretending to be what they used to be. And I find that explanation, as you said, a little bit confusing when it comes to the story perspective, but I also feel like that's what we are being told. So I'm willing to change my mind with more evidence, and I think we have kind of a lot of evidence out there.
We have a lot of different quotes. I think too, though, there is some room in the middle, that there's like space to be able to say there is a difference and also there is some continuity, you know? And I don't know. I mean, yeah, then we just get back to the question that people were asking in our 401 panel of like, well, is it the same as uploading your consciousness into a computer? Like, if there is a copy of it, can we say that it's the same thing? You know, if it looks like a person and acts like a person, then it's a person? Question mark. So I think this can be, you know, a little bit more in the gray area, even though there are two poles.
Yeah, and I'll introduce a third pole in there, the third body in the three body problem, just to throw us completely off track. I talked about in our Cosmere Dictionary Volume 1 about this concept of, in the Cosmere, a soul is the connection between the physical, cognitive, and spiritual. And that by having that connection, it's like it's a network effect and creates a soul. And then when any of those three things drops out, the connection breaks, the network effect recedes, and the soul goes away. That was kind of my merging of different elements. Jofwu, I'm wondering what you think about that. Is that completely crazy, or do you like that idea of a soul's only existing as long as there is a cooperation between the three realms in the Cosmere?
Soul is such a dangerous word. I think
It
Brendan
is.
like uses the word soul like different ways at different times.
Yeah.
But no, I like, that's an interesting idea that it's as something that connects like those three at once. I like it. I like it. I think that my inclination is to treat soul as being to like refer to like the cognitive, like a spirit is the spiritual and the soul is the cognitive aspect. And obviously there's then the physical. And I think I imagine that the sort of the spiritual is sort of what itself ties them together in the way that like a perpendicularity is like these realms being like sort of punctured in one spot. That's where my own mind goes with it. And so I think when it comes to a cognitive shadow, and that's probably what's like partly informing like my mindset on that, right? Is like that spirit is sort of this essential thing that's there. And it doesn't feel like to me that that's lost. It's just sort of being replaced with other investiture. But
that makes actually a lot of sense. You're saying the spirit or the spiritual realm aspect is the thing that is holding everything together. And then that's investiture, clearly, because it's from the spiritual realm. Whatever it is investiture. And then even if that goes away, it's kind of being replaced and informed by the cognitive aspect to the point where the spirit is maintaining whatever quote unquote soul existed. Do I have that right? Does that sound like a good summary?
That sounds right. I think that when someone dies, like their body dies, and I think that's sort of like cues in the spiritual side, like the body's dead, I end now, and now things are going to sort of dissipate.
Yeah.
And I don't know that anything in the spiritual realm ever is like entirely gone. You have like weird things like Dalinar speaking with Noadon, or this idea of the Blackthorn. You have Evie, like him hearing the voice of Evie, and he's like, is that real or not? And I think that there's like a little bit of like weird like echoes of things in the spiritual realm that are still sort of there in some capacity. But I think when someone dies, that sort of dissipates and sort of flattens out and diminishes in some sense. And I think that what happens with a cognitive shadow is there's this extra infusion of investiture that allows it to stick around beyond when it normally would.
Yeah, so let's actually talk about that, because we've mentioned this moment before, talked about in the 401 panel, but I think it is good, that question of how does the cognitive aspect, what you did refer to as a soul, but we'll keep it very linked when we just say like the cognitive aspect. I definitely like the concept of using spirit when we're talking about the spiritual realm aspect, but for that cognitive aspect, how does it get to be a cognitive shadow? And I think that does come down to expansion, which we see in Mistborn Secret History, Kelsier and Fuzz having this conversation about the Lord Ruler. Would you play this out with us?
Will do. Quote, "What about the Lord Ruler?" Kelsier said. "You say that everyone has to bend to death, but obviously that isn't true. He is immortal."
"He's a special case," Fuzz said, perking up. "He has ways of not dying in the first place."
"And if he did die," Kelsier pressed, "he'd last even longer on this side than I am, right?"
"Oh, indeed. He ascended, if just for a short time. He held enough of the power to expand his soul."
"Got it. Expand my soul." End quote.
Followed by Kelsier running to the Well of Ascension and expanding his soul. That will then begin his trajectory of perhaps expanding his soul even more, because he's going to become a sliver. We don't know what he's eventually going to do after that period of Mistborn secret history to eventually get us to Thydakar. But when it comes to what do these cognitive aspects do to become a cognitive shadow, to me, the answer does seem to be expanding that cognitive aspect or expanding that soul. So do you think that this is the best example we have on the page of this expansion process, or is there another one or a couple other ones that you think also make up good examples, Jofwu?
This is probably the best one that we see, that we have the clearest picture of. My brain goes to The Returned as maybe the next best, right? Because we kind of see a little bit of this idea of we're going to give you this divine breath and it's going to kind of pull you back together. So it's a very similar thing than what's happening with Kelsier, right?
Yeah,
Definitely.
exactly. There's kind of always this chunk of investiture that is used to kind of do the imprinting of that fossil that then creates the cognitive shadow.
Yeah, and we could just jump over to that when it comes to The Returned. I do think it's another great example because while it is a little bit tricky in the sense that I think that The Returned are a example of a cognitive shadow, but they hold a divine breath, which I would define as a splinter. And last time we did define as a splinter. So now I guess the pressure is really on. Jofwu, do you think the divine breath is a splinter while The Returned is a cognitive shadow? Or do you think those two things are linked and that you can't separate them out like that?
I think you can separate them, at least in terms of terminology. I would say that the divine breath is a splinter and The Returned is a cognitive shadow. I think that you could also call The Returned a splinter in a sense, like depending on how you're defining things, because like it's part of their soul. And so it's like, where do you want to draw the line on like, where does this thing end? And I think that's maybe a little arbitrary.
Yeah, it might be a little bit arbitrary. And for the purposes just of simple definitions, I find that example helpful when thinking about like what is the investiture that did the expanding in each circumstance, because then we also have instances like Eshonai, who is a temporary or at least a short-lived cognitive shadow at the end of their life that is expanded by the Stormfather and made.
Does that count as a cognitive shadow?
I believe it's been asked to Brandon directly because the questioner wanted some clarity about, what was going on at the end with Eshonai. And I think he said that Eshonai was a cognitive shadow expanded. Like she did die. And then the thing that was the Rider of the Storms and had the conversation with the Stormfather was the cognitive shadow of Eshonai, but she didn't do that in the last moment of her life. Do you happen to remember, Jofwu, if I'm right on that call?
I don't remember Brandon's comments on that. I do want to say that I think that there's an interesting aspect of this here where like an invested person lasts longer after death than somebody who's not. And so like my concept of this is that there's sort of this critical mass of investiture that you need to have for it to be permanent, right? To be a cognitive shadow. In my mind, I'm thinking you need to hit like a certain threshold here to be a cognitive shadow.
Yeah.
Whereas someone who's just invested is not that, but they do get to stick around longer. And so it's like they're on that road there, but they just needed a little bit more to reach the mark.
Yeah, because even when Kelsier dies, he dies invested and is able to stick around at least a little bit and talk to Fuzz longer than, other souls that are passing through do. That seems like a better comparison for me to Eshonai. Then we sort of come back to the narrative issues I think that you were talking about earlier, Joshua, of it feels really unsatisfying if Eshonai gets to have this nice moment, but it's not really her, it's just her cognitive shadow. That kind of bums me out. I would really like for it to be her.
I do think that with Eshonai, so part of what's going on with Eshonai, I can't imagine that the Stormfather is sort of helping her last longer than she would have.
Yeah.
I don't remember what the text says on that, but he's being carried around by the Stormfather, like a living perpendicularity, basically.
Yeah.
So absolutely, I could totally believe that he's helping her kind of sustain her a little bit longer than she would have otherwise.
Yeah, that question of sustaining and how long you can be sustained as a cognitive aspect versus when do you get that critical mass is difficult, and we don't have enough examples. I tried to break it down just looking at Mistborn's Secret History, just like going page by page and seeing. It seemed to me like everything was happening very fast in the sequence. That would be from like the beginning of the book till when he reaches the Well of Ascension. I found that to be all seemingly on a very short timeline. What it appeared was that a normal, non-invested person comes into the cognitive realm, has a conversation with Fuzz that does not last more than a couple of minutes. And for some of them, it seems to be almost instantaneous. Like they come in, maybe say like hi to Fuzz, and then peace out. None of them are really pushing what seems like long conversations or drawn out instances of lots and lots of time with Fuzz. And Kelsier is pushing as hard as he can, as invested as he was as a full Mistborn, and still is like falling apart. His like cognitive aspect is kind of decaying as he is running to where the Well of Ascension is. So, you know, I imagine it's like 15 minutes tops of like his falling apart cognitive aspect. So certainly when you have Eshonai or any of these characters who are lasting more than that, I begin to look for the example of like, where's that extra investiture coming from, more than just being a Radiant or more than just being a Mistborn, but some other aspect of investiture. For Eshonai, the Stormfather, and for Kelsier, eventually the Well of Ascension. We have some other examples of cognitive shadows that might be helpful to look at as well.
One that I find really interesting is Yumi and the Yokihijo. It seems to me they are splinters at birth. So kind of like returned, but from birth instead of after death. And then she becomes a cognitive shadow after going through the father machine, and that splinter that she was born with is the piece of investiture that like creates that fossilization of her cognitive shadow.
She has the added weirdness of like continuing to expand like over the centuries that she is one too, right? Because she's like taking in more and more with each cycle, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, there's a word of Brandon that the Yokihijo are accumulating more investiture as time goes on. So he has actually put her at the very top of the like most invested entity pile. Although interestingly, Elantrians are very close to Yokihijo. And we were talking about Elantrians yesterday, I think, kind of trying to figure out, are Elantrians cognitive shadows? Like, do they die when they get taken by the Shead? Not really. It doesn't seem like. So they're not cognitive shadows, but they're kind of cognitive shadows in waiting.
Yeah, this question of what are Elantrians or how do Elantrians compare is probably great for giving us like the edge case, the closest that one can be to a cognitive shadow, but also definitely not be. When asked about this, Brandon has said specifically that Elantrians are something different from a cognitive shadow. They don't actually die to be created. And elsewhere, he said that one of the key aspects of a cognitive shadow is that they do die, or they experience some version of death before becoming a cognitive shadow. So Elantrians, maybe like the Yokihijo and like Yumi before they go through the father machine,
you think they're all splinters?
I think that the Yokihijo would be defined as a splinter of virtuosity.
Yeah, the Yokihijo are, but I thought you were saying that about the Elantrians.
Oh, about Elantrians.
Like, that seems like a lot of splinter.
No, that would be a lot. No, I don't think that Elantrians are considered splinters, but maybe because of the unchained nature of investiture on Cell, they have surpassed the investiture needed to generate a cognitive shadow in the event of their death. But then because it's so hard to kill a true Elantrian, they don't actually get to that stage very often. And we have to remember that even if a heavily invested being enters into a post-death state, we'll call it, they have the option, they have the choice to go to the beyond or to fight like Kelsier did. So even an Elantrian could, I assume, choose not to become a cognitive shadow, but I think they might have enough investiture to do so without any necessary extra expansion.
I don't know if you get a choice.
What do you think, Jofwu? Do you think they have a choice in this regard? I'm pushing this back to the Lord Ruler, who was a sliver, but then faded away fairly quickly.
Yeah, the Lord Ruler does make me think that you can always sort of just disappear if you really want to. We really need Elantris too, because
yes,
there's like so many mysteries on like how Elantrians work, and like the interesting thing with them is they're like sort of sustained by the door through whatever's, you know, the aeons that are going on with the city of Elantris, right? So they're sort of partially working in that book, and then they get them working. We've seen like Elantrians off planet, and there's like, so the distance thing, like what's going on with that? How does that like, how are they sustained when they're that distant from it? So I don't feel like I have a very good understanding of the mechanics that make them what they are, but it does feel like there's something different going on with them, where it's not like the divine breath or something where they were just sort of given this one chunk, but rather like a continuously like sustaining thing that's happening.
Maybe that's closer to what Esh and I experienced with the Stormfather, as he's the continually recycled, you know, investiture.
Except for she's dead, and they're not dead.
Except for the fact that she's dead. Of course, that very key part of the experience. But if they have some type of renewed access to the door, as you said, we don't have great answers on the Elantrians, though we did see in Tress, it appeared like there was a giant Aeon on the floor of the sorcerers, the Elantrians, ship. And my guess was always that the ship itself was tricked into thinking that it was on cell, which then allowed the magic to work. What do both of you think about that as a possibility?
It might be the case. The thing that gives me pause is the fact that Galadon, as far as I know, doesn't like have something like that when he's on Rashar.
That's an excellent point, because he's the other world-hopping Elantrian that we can be pretty confident about.
There is in Secret History, right? They have their little fortress on the edge of Scadrial, and they're sort of pumping in investiture from somewhere. It seems like, right, or a connection back to Elantris to sell. So like that makes me think that it's similar to what's going on with the sorceress. But yeah, so Galadon just gives me pause. Like he's so frustrating. What is going on with Galadon? I would love to know.
Yeah, and there's the lighthouse keeper.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. From Words of Radiance. No, sorry, Oathbringer.
Oathbringer. Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of Elantrians around, and as you said, Joshua, they do not all have aeons just like built into their homes or whatever. So there has to be something else going on.
Like the lighthouse keeper, like he could have something like that in his lighthouse, and nobody just commented on it because they wouldn't know, because they didn't see it.
True enough.
But Galadon's like gallivanting across the Pure Lake and Erie and wherever he's going, right? And unless he has like a pocket aeon that just like is able to do the same thing, I don't.
Or is it possible, because we know that Vasher, who we definitely would qualify as a cognitive shadow with his status as a return, we know that he is able to use Stormlight for that renewing breath, is what he would get on Nalthis every 7 or 8 days. But on Rashar, he's able to sustain himself off consuming Stormlight. We haven't seen him do that on the page, but that's kind of our assumption. So is it possible that Galadon maybe is doing something similar, using Stormlight as the renewing mechanism rather than the door?
Maybe.
It could be. I hope that he packed a lot with him when they shipped out. Yeah, I could definitely see that. I'd love to know, and this is just a mystery, I guess, in general, right? How are they like doing that conversion? But yeah, no, that seems plausible to me.
Yeah, and certainly the aspect of converting or doing conversions is probably going to be more seen in the far future, maybe post the back half of Stormlight Archive, because we know that with BEUs, just recently at Dragonsteel, Brandon talked about how B uses one method of measurement throughout the Cosmere in the future, and that there are other groups that have different means of measurement, much like the metric system versus Imperial. You can do the conversions, and people know the conversions, and we should probably be using the metric system, but we don't. And that difference exists in the Cosmere as well. Someone's out there saying everybody should use BEUs, and then there's a whole other group of people, we don't know who they are, who are using their standard instead. So it certainly will be an aspect in the future, and I wonder if Fabrials and maybe the mother of machines will have something to do with that, as Navani was so interested in helping our type 1 invested entities not be under a form of slavery or kind of like forced work. And I'm very excited to see how that all plays out.
Okay, but now that you've mentioned Stormlight, I want to talk about the Heralds, because the Heralds are also cognitive shadows, but I feel confused about how. And maybe that's partially just because we still don't have all the answers, and we got some information in Wind and Truth, but I think not all of the information. Because
certainly not.
Even when they are made into heralds, when they enter into the Oath Pact, that's like not the beginning of their invested journey. They have been Surge Binders for seemingly a very long time, and we don't really know how they initially became Surge Binders. They have extremely long lives, and we don't really understand why or how that's the case. So like, were they already maybe like an Elantrian type thing, like a pre-cognitive shadow before becoming heralds? Is becoming a herald the thing that makes them a cognitive shadow? What is the piece of investiture that is like creating that? I have so many questions. Tell me all of your thoughts.
Okay. Well, yeah, you've just asked all of the big questions. Jofwu, do you want to try to start us off, or would you like me to guide us into this?
The Heralds, I don't think that they were like cognitive shadows. I don't think they had that much investiture. I think they just had a lot, and in a way that was making them long-lived, right? So there are like beings in the Cosmere that are relatively long-lived, but are still not immortal, I guess. And that's my impression of what's happening there, because they definitely, when they become cognitive shadows, when they become the heralds, when they get their honor blades, they are actually immortal. They can't die. They continue to live, as long, until something kills them. So I feel like there's a change that happens there that's beyond just simply being highly invested.
That period where we see in Wind and Truth, the kind of first vision that works is the arrival from Ashen, and then they jump ahead in time. I think it's 60 years, but that's when the kind of falling apart of the relationship is really on display, and they're needing to make a choice about fighting the Singers. We see a conversation with Ash when she says something along the lines of, I've been a teenager for the last 60 years and like grown tired of it, and she like wants to make her own choices. And that is prior to the Oath Pact. So there had to be some surge binding, or whatever aspect we want to call it. They had some investiture that was sustaining them, preventing their aging, except on a very slow scale.
I think they even specifically say that it's the surge binding
of Ashen
that extends their lives. But then they are aging. They're just aging very slowly. And part of the Oath Pact and the deal with honor is that they will be immortal. Because
exactly.
I think it's Ashar who's like, aren't you worried about getting older and like your mortality?
Not too worried. I'm definitely not too worried about it. Just a little bit.
Yeah, just mildly worried.
One thing, just to add another wrinkle into that, is it's wild to me that Ash like is part of that, apparently just by birth, right? Like I don't think she like got these like same powers from Odium or from Honor, the
like
same
as
way
a
that
9-year-old or whatever.
Yeah, she was just seemingly born with those because her dad, maybe also her mom, had them, right? So it's crazy that they were passed on genetically like that.
It is crazy, especially when we have a main character in Shallan, your favorite character, who we now know is the daughter of a herald. And like, what
does that mean?
What instances are passed on genetically, or what can be changed in a person's spirit web when so much investiture is on display? But before we start talking about the children of cognitive shadows, let's keep on just cognitive shadows as a whole, because I think that that's about the beginning. When we see this oath pact, it is a transition, and we see a similar transition from Kaladin at the end of Wind and Truth. He, in my estimation, I would say that Kaladin dies at the end of Wind and Truth, and he becomes a herald that we all define as a cognitive shadow. And the oath pact is the thing that, in my mind, does the expansion for all of them.
But in this case, they're not, it seems to me like they're not gifted a chunk of investiture. Rather, they're granted like a channel that goes kind of directly to the power of honor and is just like constantly funneling investiture into them.
Actually,
right? Like, is there a chunk?
I think there might be a chunk. I think both things are true. I think the network effect, to use that terminology again, I think the oath pact creates a network effect, and that might have a channel back to honor's power. But I also think that there is a chunk of honor. At least we see chunks of honor break off in Wind and Truth.
For the honor blades, but that's different.
I don't know how many chunks break off. Let's just put it that way. And I think that is certainly one is going to the creation of the honor blade. So it's like, is that the chunk that they need? Is the honor blade connected to them in the same way a divine breath is connected to a herald?
I don't think so.
Or do they have another chunk that makes them a cognitive shadow? What do you think about this? Is there a chunk of honor involved in the creation of the heralds?
I would be surprised if their honor blades are not linked to them in a deeper way. Like, it's not a completely separate thing.
Mm-hmm.
To some extent, it feels like it clearly is, because there can be like a separation. They can leave it behind, and Zeth can pick up Jezreel's honor blade and sort of bond it in some sense and like carry it around, and it could be his, right? But it's obviously not granting him the powers that a herald has. And so I think that there has to be something that's in Jezreel himself that makes him a herald. I'm inclined to think that there's still some kind of link to that honor blade with the heralds, that they have some inherent connection to their blade, and it's not just a completely separate piece of investiture, but it could be.
Do they still have surge binding when they don't have their honor blades?
Do they still have surge binding when they don't have their honor blades? I don't think they have access to their surges as we see them with the Knight's Radiant, unless they have their honor blades.
The blade is giving them surge binding. The oath pact is making them a cognitive shadow and like enabling them to come back after death and like create their body again magically, which is unique to the heralds in terms of cognitive shadows.
My gut says that they are all loosely tied together in some way, that they're not like in completely separate components, that they are all sort of distinct components in a system that's working together.
Yeah, they do seem to be a system for sure.
Okay, on that note, I think it would be great if we could read this quote about the nature of the bond, the nature of the oath pact for the heralds, because I think it will help us solidify everything that we have been talking about for the last few minutes. So if you could, Brooke.
Quote, "The bond is what keeps us alive. You sever that and we will slowly decompose into ordinary souls with no valid connection to the physical or spiritual realms. Capture one of us with your knives and you won't be left with a spread in a jar, foolish ones. You'll be left with a being that eventually fades away into the beyond." End quote. And that is from Kalek.
So with that description, I think that we have a lot of the terminology that Jofwu, you were mentioning before. He's saying if you sever the bond of the oath pact, we will slowly decompose into ordinary souls.
So they're almost like temporary cognitive shadows. Like they're only cognitive shadows when connected to the bond, which I guess maybe is the same as like a returned having their divine breath. When they lose their divine breath, they're dead.
And not just the divine breath, right? But they still need like a supply of breaths to keep living, even as a return.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And I think the moment of giving up the divine breath and then the fading away into the beyond, like the death of the returned follows, is a little bit like a peaceful example of what Kalek is getting at here. If you capture us with one of your knives, you're not just left with the spren, you're left with something that's going to fade into the beyond.
But here's where I have another Wind and Truth question. We see Yezrian stabbed with the knife, and he goes into the gemstone, and then seemingly, as Kalek is saying, he fades away into the beyond. All of the other heralds are like, oh no, he's dead. But in Wind and Truth, we see El go in and get that gemstone, and there's like some of Yezrian left. Like, what is that?
Jofwu, you got any stabs at this new Wind and Truth information? It's kind of hard to be put on the spot because I know that we're still in the early days of Wind and Truth and trying to figure out all of these different aspects. But what did you think about that scene with El and the final release of Yezrian?
You asked if I wanted to take a stab at it, which seemed like a really dark way to phrase that. I'm inclined to think that like the investiture that like was Yezrian, like after it was put in the gemstone, was sort of, I don't know, like just sort of dissolving into mush. Like he sort of got vaporized, you know, and it's just sort of the pieces of him left. Like if you like cremated somebody and like had their ashes left over, you know, like there's still like matter that's there. Like I don't think it was like actual Yezrian in there. It's just like the pieces that were him that are sort of left over in a goop that's sort of still inside the gym. El does note that there's like not much of him left. He like sticks the anti-stormlight in, and there's just sort of like, there wasn't much left that was in there. So
I certainly think that example with El is telling. It's letting us know that whatever it is, this goop of Yezrian, this remnants, it's not much, which then points us back to the Oath Pact as the really important thing. That is kind of like the defining characteristic of what it means to be a herald, which probably tells us a lot about what could happen in the back half of Stormlight Archive with this new herald, a new energy from this new herald to repair the broken heralds of yesteryear. And if he is successful in that, I would imagine that that's strengthening the bonds between them and maybe like strengthening them as heralds of the Almighty, who doesn't technically exist anymore.
Do cognitive shadows always, I mean, seemingly not always, get their own bodies? I'm just thinking the heralds obviously can make their own body out of investiture every time they come back from Braze. The returned they get some body when they come back. I don't know if that's the same body that they had before, but then Kelsier becomes a cognitive shadow and seemingly doesn't have a way to like make himself a body. It seems like he has stapled himself into some other type of body.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Zombie Kelsier.
Yeah.
Zombie Thydakar.
Yeah.
I think Kelsier has his own like original bones that he was stuck back to.
Oh.
And so I think that's what's happening with him. So it's sort of his pieces of
He's
his
done
body.
like a Chondra situation, like processed his bones.
And if you have enough of your original matter, because we see this with Hoyd at the very end, he gets obliterated and then rebuilt. Now, obviously, he's very unusual, but he's also clearly not a cognitive shadow. We talked about this in response to a
Who
fan
the heck
question.
knows what Hoyd is?
Yeah, he's definitely got a lot of investiture, but I also don't think that he is necessarily the same as a cognitive shadow. And even saying that, I think that Kelsier's transition to Thydakar, which I always put at the point when he comes back into the physical realm, again, mainly just for linguistic purposes or the ease of talking about these different stages of Kelsier. But if he did have his bones, which I think is hinted at in the end of Era 1, that like his bones were collected, then yeah, maybe that's enough of his physical body plus the cognitive shadow to then, like the heralds, rebuild his body when he comes back into the physical realm.
Maybe it's just a matter of proficiency with your power. Like maybe the heralds are able to do it right away because they've spent maybe thousands of years surge binding. And I'm trying to think, because like Yumi is maybe eventually able to make herself a body. We know that Spren, well, maybe not all Spren, but design cryptics are able to do a light weaving that is so lifelike that it is kind of indistinguishable from a body. So again, like, what is real? Does that count? Like, if a light weaving is realistic enough to be indistinguishable from the real thing, is it the real thing?
Yeah, reality is what I decided to be.
What is real?
Love that quote.
So do I. And I love that moment. I love what it says about the power that Shallan has. I don't know why she has that power. Let's not get too distracted on that question.
Yeah. And when we're talking about cognitive shadows and bodies, then there's also the fused, who have an entirely different situation where they have to hijack another singer's body in order to come back, which is very different from the heralds, maybe closer to something like what Kelsier is doing. But I find those differences between different types of cognitive shadows very interesting.
How do you think the fused fit into these different equations? Like, what are they expanded by? What are they maybe sustained by?
Yeah.
How do you think this plays out for the fused, Jofwu?
It is interesting that they don't have something like the divine breath or like the honor blades or whatever as clearly, at least, as those others do. I'm inclined to think that they have something, that Odium has given them something that makes them a cognitive shadow, but I don't. It's just weird that it's not remarked on, that it's some like notable splinter, I guess, of Odium's power.
Yeah, so unclear. I guess maybe it's sort of like an oath pact situation where there's just sort of an ongoing connection between Odium and the fused. I don't know.
I definitely think that they have that ongoing connection, and we see that play out with like with Leshwi, for example, because she gets cut off. And so I'm inclined to think that they have some chunk of investiture. Maybe it's a smaller chunk. Than some of these others have, which explains why they're not as powerful as the heralds, for example. So they have some splinter of Odium, perhaps that's part of their soul. But yeah, then they do have that kind of constant connection that sort of is necessary to sustain them. Yes,
and what's so interesting about the singers, of course, is that they are also able to re-infuse or to re-energize for their void light through, I think, what is the Song of Prayer? That like summons back and
it creates void light.
Void light for them. Yeah. And so I'm wondering if the fused have an even greater ability to do that. Maybe, they're more aligned with Odium, but that sustaining function is done through something similar, like the Song of Prayer. I don't think it's identical, but that there is a song that is connecting the fused back to Odium, just to keep everything real Risharan.
And we see it like with Leshwi, Shanaeum, the heavenly ones. They can like fly around indefinitely, right? Like they're not having to use gemstones of void light to be able to do that, because Odium just sort of it comes from that constant supply.
But they only have, I think, 1 lashing's worth of speed, sort of, so they can use it indefinitely, but at a constant rate.
Yeah.
Now, the fused, I think, are actually one of the best examples of when Vasher says that cognitive shadows are consumed by a singular purpose. And this is the same time when he's talking about them masquerading as men.
And he says that they're bound and chained by their intent, which is also super interesting.
And so when we hear about these fused, both in Rhythm of War as well as in Wind and Truth, two that jump out immediately to me that kind of fit that mold are Lesian the Pursuer and Abidi the Monarch. Abadai the Monarch. Jofwu, how would you pronounce that one for us?
I've been saying Abidi, but I don't know I haven't done the audiobook. I don't know what they say there.
In the audiobook, they say Abadai, but in my brain, I say Abidi.
Abidi. Okay, so we have 3 different pronunciations.
We have like 5 different pronunciations.
That's what you love to hear. Yeah, exactly. That's the goal of all podcasts, is just to be just confusing enough to keep everybody guessing. Clearly, those two fuse, and I think the other fused as well. They seem to be consumed by a singular purpose. Lesian, obviously, likes pursuing, but more importantly, when the pursuing is denied to him, when he is unable to pursue as he sees fit, he begins to kind of rage and seemingly deteriorate in his overall health and purpose. And I think that's because he is kind of like kept sane, kept well by the fact that he is pursuing, that he is leaning in to the singular purpose.
You think that that is the thing that is helping some fused stay sane?
I do, yes. I think that the more...
Then what's Leshwi's singular purpose?
I think Leshwi's might be the honorable nature that she chooses to fight and like lead her group. And like, as long as she is doing that, then she remains healthy, mentally stable, however we want to define that. And then the worrying thing that happens at Wind and Truth is that she is cut off. She's walking around in the mud. She doesn't really necessarily see herself as honorable anymore. And that's when you start to see, again, we don't get much in the way of those chapters, but when we are shown Leshwi in Wind and Truth, she does seem to be struggling with that instance of like, who am I? What is my purpose? Because she doesn't have it anymore.
I mean, I think there's a difference, though, a distinction here between an intent and then perception. I don't know if there's a better word for that that's more like Cosmere specific, but we've talked a lot about the way that perception influences like Spren, for example, and then as cognitive shadows, sort of similar to Spren, there is perhaps a chance that the perception of other people influence a cognitive shadow, or one's own perception influencing oneself as a cognitive shadow, which I think is more of what you're saying in relationship to Leshwi. Like, if her perception of herself has changed, does that impact how sane she is able to stay as a cognitive shadow? Is there some kind of dissonance between the perception or like the role that she's kind of been assigned and the way that she actually is? But to me, that seems different than this consumed by a singular purpose that Vasher is saying, which I would see more as the mission that Returned take when they decide to come back. They see something and they're like, okay, I want to change what I have seen, and therefore I will come back. And that is what their divine breath is going to be used for. And then with the heralds, we see them sort of consumed by a specific kind of job. I think Nail is maybe the most clear example of that, of like really being dedicated to the one thing. And I think those are a little bit different than just a perception situation.
That's interesting. How would you explain that and those differences, Jofwu?
I don't know if I've made quite that same distinction before. I do think that the fused, you can tell that like they have this purpose that they sort of internalized as part of their identity. And so in my mind, that's what that intent is, with the capital I. And so I think that I see that. And I guess to me, like the way it's playing out differently for them is just like, I don't know how crazy that purpose is. Like you see it with the Pursuer or Abidi or even Raboniel, right? Like she has kind of this like really like this goal of ending this war at whatever cost. And I think she's a little bit more sane than some of the others, but like she has that. You can't forget like the fuse that are out there that are just completely bonkers, right?
Exactly.
That like can't even function, that can't even fight. Like that's the other end of the scale. not to go completely off the rails.
No, take us there.
Kind of comparing to all these, others. Kelsier is like the most fun one to me on like how is his intent and his sort of self-perception of where he's headed and what he wants shaping who he is as a cognitive shadow.
I think Kelsier has the advantage in that his intent is to survive, and that's like inherently helpful as a cognitive shadow.
Right.
Yeah, it's both a great purpose or a great capital I intent, but then also it is a great source and a great fuel to keep yourself around over and over again. Kelsier is always going to be interesting, especially when we get to Era 2, and we know that he is being worshipped in distinct ways. And how does that mess with his cognitive self, the cognitive shadow that he is? Is it helpful? Is it hurtful? Is it a singular purpose to survive, or is it a singular purpose to be worshipped? And then once he is worshipped, is that dividing his kind of capital I intent? How would you come down on those questions, Jofwu?
I'm inclined to think that the perception of other people on a cognitive shadow are not meaningless. I think that there is something there that's probably like tangibly happening. I'm skeptical that it's like as meaningful as like a lot of people might interpret it to be, just because he does have his own sapience and his own mind. I think it just gets really weird if like sapient beings are sort of being significantly influenced by the thoughts of other people. And so I'm inclined to think that there's like maybe some influence, but it's mostly like authentically him. I do wonder about like the ability to change that intent.
Like, can they
is
change
he
it?
stuck with that, or is there room for that to sort of evolve and change over time? And that goes back to the fused as well, right? Like with Leshy, for example, and she's having to kind of rethink her purpose to some extent. I'll be curious to see how that works out.
It'll certainly be interesting to see how it plays out. And we were asked by longtime patron Kyle, you can join us over on Patreon anytime, it's super great, who asked if cognitive shadows can become shard vessels, because we see Kelsier as a cognitive shadow become a sliver, temporarily pick up the power of a shard, but could they actually become the permanent vessel of a shard was their question. And I think a quote from Mistborn Secret History, as they so often do, will help shine a light on the answer to this.
Ruin says to Kelsier, quote, "Look at you, Kelsier. You haven't form or shape. You're not alive. You're an idea. A memory of a man holding the power will never be as potent as a real one with ties to all three realms," end quote. And we hear that in Wind and Truth as well, that it's really important for a shard vessel to specifically have ties to the physical realm. So it seems like not really would be the answer. Cognitive shadows probably cannot be shard vessels.
I think that they probably can, with the caveat that there's this other component that matters. Ruin is a jerk, and he's just kind of being mean to Kelsier. So
that's fair.
Kelsier does regain some level of connection to the physical realm, right? And so I'm inclined to think that somebody like Vasher, somebody who has that connection to the physical realm, is able to.
That's a good point. And maybe the reason for Kelsier becoming Thydakar, as I described it, as him getting a body, maybe that was because Ruin was correct when he said this to Kelsier, which was just at his cognitive shadow stage. But then, like you're saying, if he was able to reconnect himself to the physical realm, perhaps that is enough, that he has then become something closer to a returned, which is a little bit better. But I would make note that Thydakar, at the end of Era 2, with his body, is still not able to be a Mistborn, to use allomancy. And so I do think there's still something missing, even despite all that he has done to kind of correct that break between the three realms that he experienced.
Like, I don't think it's like a simple box that you can check, like, oh, I've got a piece of me is in the physical realm now, so like, check that box, now I can do this thing. Like, it's kind of a different thing, but my mind goes to like in the Oath Pact thing that's going on in Wind and Truth, where they're like trying to decide like how many people are going to be part of the Oath Pact. And Honor has this like long thing where he's like, well, it could be 4 people or it could be 10 people. It definitely can't be 9. 16 would be great. It's like all these like it kind of almost sounds like really arbitrary. And so I'm imagining that like when it's this, oh, you need ties to the physical realm, it's just sort of this very sort of soft magic-y kind of, there's things going on that are sort of just too complex in the spiritual realm for us to understand. And so I think that there's something there that needs to happen. I'm just willing to believe that like, it's just not a blanket no for any kind of cognitive shadow. There's probably ways around
fair.
that issue.
I'm curious if it would be different for a being like a returned or even Kelsier, who has seemingly, you know, a permanent body. It's like around all the time, versus a herald or a fused who have bodies and then lose them and then create them again or like get a new one. Would it be more difficult for them maybe to be a vessel because their connection to the physical realm is a little bit more transient?
That's a good question. And especially that idea of the heralds as well as the fused, they have this period of their existence when they do not have a body and they're on Braze. Now they're kind of in the, someone called it the Kaladin's therapy bubble universe.
Yeah.
Or just like wherever they happen to be mentally after
the good place.
In my timeline, sometimes I put like a cheeky name for one of the entries of some event, and I put I couldn't help myself putting something about the heralds having a beach episode.
Perfect.
For man, one. I love the beach episode. Sorry, you distracted me. That existence in the in-between state, I think, is also supported by the Spren that will be going with Kaladin, because he's not alone. And I always feel like, you know, they're better together. And I think that there might be an interesting question. I know that Nail also has a Spren, and in the previous periods of torture, Nail Spren was along for that unfortunate ride. And now you have this opportunity for the heralds to improve themselves. I think Syl wants to improve herself. That's what we heard a lot in Wind and Truth. And so like, how will the strengthening of one another and the strengthening of the bonds between them improve their power? Because Brandon said when he was giving that hierarchy of Yoki Hijo at the top, Elantrians very close, and then heralds, he said specifically that heralds were weaker in part because there were so many determining factors when it comes to, are they aligned with their oaths? Are they aligned with the powers of Rashar? And so there's a lot more variability in their power. But I'm wondering if what we're going to see is like a alignment of all of the heralds, a strengthening of their bond leading to stronger heralds in the back half. That's at least what I'm hopeful for. Anyone else want to make any soft predictions about how the heralds will develop with Kaladin in the back half?
Well, that is interesting because something I was thinking about earlier when we were kind of discussing all of the different influxes of power to the people who become the heralds is 9 of them were originally Surge Binders, but I don't think Taln is originally a Surge Binder, and yet he becomes like maybe the most powerful herald, which I find interesting. I would have thought that having previously been Surge Binders and had some type of power sort of separate from, or at least prior to Honor, would make them more powerful because they're gaining like power on top of power, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
He did try to kill cultivation.
Yeah, and then they say his soul is warped.
His soul was...
Which to me almost sounds like a little bit of a microcosm of what happens to all of Rashar after the clash between Odium and Honor. Like the time warp that they are now in is a spiritual realm warping. And if you go up against a shard like Taln did, that could happen just to yourself. And so like bent around his own soul. Corrupted is not the right word, but kind of like transformed. We Brooke and I have not had a chance to really dive into all the nitty gritty of Wind and Truth. But Jofwu, what do you think about that scene with the Bearer of Agonies? Taln and Ash kind of go on their fighting rampage, because from my understanding, they do that without their honor blades, and they do that without any access to their surges as we know them. Would you agree with that take?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and Nail does it too, right?
Yes.
Like when he's fighting Kaladin, he's like, it's been a long time since I've had I fought a mortal, that I had to use my true powers with. Yeah. So there's definitely like more powers there. We actually saw with Taln in the end of Words of Radiance. I think like he Ray shoots like a blow dart at Amarim, and like he does this like super speed, like catches the blow dart in the air. So there's like some foreshadowing for that. So they definitely have powers that is beyond just the honor blade. I'm not really clear on completely clear on when they gained those. There are like, we do see some comments from like the Tanavas flashbacks where he's talking about like the heralds sort of becoming more powerful, becoming like more unchained over the course of events. We also are told, I think that there's a suggestion that those powers come from a connection with Roshar itself.
Yes.
I wish I had that quote in front of me, because it's a pretty, I think that's the one where Tanavast says, he's like, even I don't understand why this is happening, but I was afraid to tell them and come across like I don't know what I'm talking about.
Which is always great from your gods. That's definitely what you want. But I think that point and that distinction is what makes heralds fundamentally different than a lot of these other cognitive shadows, and why there's going to be so much attention, including books in the back half of the Stormlight Archive that are mainly about the heralds or their perspectives on events. But I would probably classify it as most of the heralds from Ashen had some type of surge binding. They bring that with them and use that surge binding to get to Roshar, aided by honor in those conflicts with Odium. And then upon arrival on Roshar, you have the fundamental forces left behind by Adonalsium, including the stone, the night, and the wind, that I would say represent the power of Roshar. And it is that power that Taln is really, really good at. And that is the thing that he is maybe best at, where other heralds might have other surges. Taln is the master of Roshar, or whatever power of Roshar exists. And then, of course, they all have eventually the surges that we know of the Knights Radiant because of their honor blades. That's how I would like see the differences in their power, and I'm wondering what you think about that. Let's start with Brooke this time.
I have no idea. I think that's a pretty bold claim. I think there's just still so many questions about what exactly these fundamental forces of Roshar are. Why are they able to access them? How do they work? Because my understanding is that surge binding is, we can use surge binding as a general term for like using the fundamental forces of the Cosmere, and on different planets in different ways, people can access those forces.
Certainly.
So then how would this be different would be my question. Like, is it surge binding just in a different way? Is he using the power of Adonalsium? I find that hard to believe, but maybe.
Jofwu, how would you think about that display of power and kind of these differences in potential sources of power? I would kind of agree with Brooke, is that if we're going to call surge binding the umbrella term, then yeah, this all falls under surge binding. But the way that I kind of broke it out, like the Ashen powers, the power of Roshar, and then their honor blade powers, where do you see the crossover and the blend of those things?
So I think that when they became heralds, I feel like honor sort of mostly like overwrote or sort of tapped into those existing surge binding powers they have. Mm-hmm. So to some extent, they're kind of built on top of each other, which makes it even more muddy. I do like the idea of Taln sort of, I guess, being more proficient with those more kind of mysterious powers. I think it makes sense to call it surge binding in some sense. It's always frustrating because the Rosharans just like call everything. It's like, oh, it's magic, it's surge binding, and you don't know like where we're drawing the lines on that. But it also makes sense, right? Because you have the fused are surge binding, right? So it's not just like specifically an honor thing. It's odium, like all the magic that's happening here. We're kind of calling it surge binding. But it does seem older. It seems to predate this sort of magic systems. It's a softer magic. So I'm not sure where that falls. I do think that I can see Talon being more proficient at it. I'll be surprised if in the later Stormlight books, if we don't see a resurgence of more of that.
Yeah, I think that's probably great speculation and a good prediction, because the capital Wind was such a unique introduction in Wind and Truth, and these kind of like three forces that are not of honor cultivation or odium, but seem to predate the Shard's arrival on the planet, even though they might have, we'll say, manipulated, but kind of like softly transformed some of that energy into their own energy and their mini avatars. I want to transition us, though, from Roshar, from the Heralds, and move us over to one of the darker and the most complicated example of cognitive shadows. I'm talking about the Shades from Threnody, as well as on Canticle with the Sunlit Man. So could you start us off, Brooke, with another quote this time about exactly what we know about these Shades?
This comes from Chris, and she says, quote, "People on Threnody are afflicted with a particular ailment that, upon death, sometimes turns them into what we would call a cognitive shadow. I will leave aside the nature of whether or not a cognitive shadow is actually the soul of a person. This is a question for a theologian or a philosopher," end quote.
And a question that we have already debated quite a bit. So we'll leave that aside as well. And Jofwu, how would you rank the Shades, firstly, on this scale of cognitive shadows? They clearly have enough similarities, but if we're going back to where we started, like, what is their expansion? What is the extra element of investiture? And then how seemingly widespread on Threnody the possibility of becoming a Shade is, plus the zombie nature of like one Shade can make a new Shade. That's a different and distinct element as well.
That is different, yeah.
I think they're pretty relatively low powered.
Mm-hmm.
At least in terms of, I don't know how much investiture is in them, which is kind of weirdly strange because it is kind of, I guess, very different from how scary they are. Everybody seems to be very afraid of them, more afraid of them than they might be of other cognitive shadows, perhaps. But they seem to be lower powered, and it's just, I guess, coming from this perception that like clearly they exist because ambition was splintered and killed, and investiture just went flying everywhere. And my impression is that it just sort of a bunch of investors smashed into Threnody and infused everything there in weird ways, warped the souls of the people there in weird ways. And I do think that it is like genetic, perhaps. I mean, obviously it can be passed on, right, in multiple ways. And so there's that aspect of what's happening with them. The other thing about them that's weird to me is like the Shades that we see, they are not like, they're sort of mentally deteriorated, right? Mm-hmm. Like compared to all these other ones, they've kept their mind, they've kept their memories and all these things. Whereas the Shades, they don't have that. There's maybe like an inkling of the memories that they had from when they were alive, but it's mostly gone. And that's something that's very interesting about them. And I think it adds to that sense to me that they're lower powered, which I guess is not necessarily the case. They could be high powered and their memories just got lost because of whatever mechanics happened. But it just contributes to this idea to me that they are a little bit different than the others.
Yeah, they almost seem more like the lifeless. Is that the right word? From Nalthis? Yeah, where they're basically gone, but there's kind of an echo of the person that they used to be somewhere in there. But I definitely don't think we would consider a lifeless a cognitive shadow.
Certainly not. And I think that Shades as cognitive shadows are probably on the lower side of power scale, but they also represent the most widespread. And so we might need to think about it as like the process of creation for each of these being very orderly versus very disorderly. And when you go in a disordered system, Brooke is now making faces at me. So what do you got?
Well, I was also going to say there is the chorus on Canticle, which you referenced, but we haven't really talked about. I'm wondering if maybe the chorus is a more representative version of the shades. Like, is that what all shades would be like if they're taken off of Threnody? Like, maybe they're only...
Because of Threnody?
Yeah, so shady on Threnody, because there is kind of a cloud of like negative investiture or something happening on and around the planet. And if you remove them from that atmosphere, they become at least a little bit more like a typical cognitive shadow, and like they're able to fabricate stuff.
I would try to make a connection to capital C connection. I think that the chorus are perhaps an example of slightly more ordered creation, purposeful creation, if there was an intent behind the creation of the chorus.
Aren't they shades that have been brought from Threnody?
Yes. No, you're totally right.
Okay.
And that's at least my understanding. So they're shades that are brought from Threnody, but when done with this purpose and this intent to form a community and to form a connection to others, especially by the time we get them to Canticle, like it's built around their society. And I think that could, in a way, be strengthening the shades from the chaotic, scary, and, zombie style that we see in Silence of the Forest of Hell. But I want to get Jofwu's take on this. How do you see the shades kind of interacting, and then the difference when it comes to the chorus?
So I'm not clear if the ones on Canticle, if they have shades that were taken from Threnody, or if it's just the souls of the people that have died since they left.
Yeah.
I can't remember if that's clear one way or the other, because there's certainly some of them that are there since they left. I'm inclined to think that the perceptions of the community really shape the chorus a lot. This seems to me like it aligns with the idea that they are sort of lower powered, such that the perceptions of other people influence them more so than one that's more sapient, right?
Yes.
And so to me, it seems like, I can't remember if there's anything explicit or heavily implicit about that in Sunlit Man, but it does seem to me like the community sort of coming together and having this idea in their mind of this is what they are, these are our ancestors, right? Shapes who they are and makes them a little bit more something more useful than just monsters, roaming in the woods. So it's interesting to think of. I think Silence's own experience with her grandmother. Yes. Is it her grandmother or her mother?
I think it might be her mother, but yeah, her elder, right, is a shade that is around and does seem to have some type of memory, or at least Silence is influencing that shade's memory enough to kind of keep it a little bit more peaceful. I do have one mega theory, but I'm going to just present the tiniest slice, the tiniest sliver to Jofwu here about the creation of the shades, and my answer to what is expanding them, what is keeping them around, like we've talked about with so many of these other cognitive shadow examples. I think that the shades are one, but not the only one, of the examples of investiture on the microorganism level.
Oh no.
I'm not going to go into it all.
Oh no.
You hear it, you see the eye rolls, Jofwu, and this is because I never stopped talking about
us in front of company.
So this is definitely one of my craziest theories. I have it connected to everything. I'm not going to try to present it all, but I do think that we have gotten hints from Brandon that something about what was going on in Ashen was happening at the very, very small level, the organism or bacterial level. We've gotten some hints that could be applicable elsewhere in the Cosmere as well. Do you think there's a possibility that upon that destruction of ambition, that Threnity's microorganisms, including the ones within people, were the thing that were fundamentally changed and kind of did the bad version of what the AVR get when they are eating and kind of like ingest it's little.
It's like a worm, I think.
Yeah. So that's another example happening on the small scale where it like builds up to an invested power. I'm basically saying this would be the negative version of that from the very small scale, influencing these people on Threnody and then turning them into shades. What do you think about that crazy theory, Jofwu?
So the microorganisms become invested, and then they invest the people.
I would think it would have to be something similar to the Sheod and the Riod on Cell, where like the thing that happens in the case of Threnody, the death of ambition, just kind of reverses what was happening. So yeah, I think theoretically the people who become shades in a different timeline would have been people who become invested and like get powers.
Oh, kind of like
because of the sort of reversal or the corruption of what happens in that system, instead of that path, they end up becoming shades.
Okay.
Would be my guess.
Interesting.
Do you think this, like, it persists in this way, in the sense that like a nomad coming into contact with these Threnodites, is he like in danger of sort of contracting it?
Oh, is it contagious in that respect? I don't think so. I think that the contagion that Nomad is at risk at is what we see. He becomes part of the community and accepted by the community so much that he becomes of Canticle, and he, you know, gets the new name of Zellion to like represent that change over. So I don't know if there's a possibility of being physically infected in that way.
You're thinking it's more just like the gut bacteria that we all have. Like I can't pass my gut bacteria to you in any kind of normal way.
Not in normal circumstances. But if you had shades that were, yes, infected, closer to a zombie apocalypse in the, you know, style of movies that we see, then that could be how they are able to touch others and turn them into shades upon their death, is a infection sort of passing the shade curse. But instead of it being a magic curse, it's an actual invested bacterial infection. So yeah, still a magic curse, just for the record.
I like the use of curse there. It's fitting for the shades. Look, I'm not saying I'm going to put all my marbles in this basket, but
don't do it.
But I'm going to watch your theory with great interest.
Okay, that's a perfect place to.
That was the nicest rejection.
I thought it was great. I'm very happy with that. I think getting a soft rejection and presenting crazy theories is also a great time to segue us to our conclusion and to kind of wrap things up here a bit. I believe that we mentioned up front that we were not going to cover everything about cognitive shadows. There are still more secrets to uncover.
Always.
And there's more information from Wind and Truth. I think that there will be more information that we'll get over this next year. There will be the release of Isles of the Emberdark, which I imagine has a lot to do with the cognitive realm, and we might see more examples of these cognitive shadows on display. But I think the biggest thing that we've left off is the one that we're kind of purposely not touching, and that is Tanavast, the Stormfather, cognitive shadows wrapped up with Honor's power. And that's where I want some of your opinions out there, listeners. I want you to reply, let us know, reach out, give me, with all of the information that we've presented, how does the new facts that we've gotten from Wind and Truth about the Stormfather, about Tanavast, and about the history there apply to a cognitive shadow? Are they closer to an Elantrian? Are they closer to a shade? Where are the little nuts and bolts that we are missing? So I know you've got opinions out there. I want to hear those opinions.
You want to throw a Blackthorn grenade into that mix as well?
Yes, do that for us. Like let's do, everybody's sending us off with kind of a different question or a different audience pitch. I'm saying hit me with some Tanavast and Stormfather tidbits Jofwu, you've introduced the next one. Throw that grenade out there for him.
It's not just, I think, Tanavest that's really spicy in Wind and Truth, but also we get this idea of the Blackthorn. That's like this thing that has existed in the cognitive space and has been given life, which is a totally wild new thing that's maybe a cognitive shadow. It seems like it is.
Is it a spiritual shadow since it's coming out of the spiritual realm?
Right. I don't know, but I don't know. Maybe people that are listening have opinions. I have my own opinions, but they're way too lengthy to get into here.
I think that is a perfect example, though. Every new bit of information that we get kind of changes the things that we've known before. Because if we were going to call this Blackthorn a cognitive shadow, that might have implications for other things that we have labeled cognitive shadows. But as you said, the Blackthorn Pandora's box is a big one to open up here at the end of our conversation. So we would love to hear back from any of the listeners. What do you think about this new introduction of the Blackthorn? And Brooke, I'm going to toss it to you just in case. Do you have another question to throw out there for the audience?
Yeah, I can throw a spicy question out there. I think one topic on which we might disagree with some people is Kaladin. What is Kaladin now? He is a cognitive shadow. Does that mean he's still Kaladin? Is he a different thing entirely? Like, is Kaladin dead? There's a body. What do we think about that? I personally have been thinking Kaladin is dead, and now we only have the cognitive shadow of Kaladin, which is in some ways a different thing. But I think some people might be upset about that. So tell me your opinions.
Kaladin is dead, but the Herald will see what they can do.
Yes.
Well, there you go. We have 3 different last-minute questions for the audience. There are plenty more when it comes to cognitive shadows and souls and spirits throughout the Cosmere, and it's something Brandon clearly likes playing with. He didn't introduce this Blackthorn concept because he finds it boring. It's something he wants to explore more, and he's basically explored in one way or another on every single planet and in every single story. So I've had a great time exploring the different depths of cognitive shadows. I want to give a big shout out to Jofwu. Thank you so much for being here. And we'll give you a moment if you would like to do any other plugs to your social media, or if you have any closing thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. It was a bit of fun conversation, and it's always a good time to hang out. So thanks for inviting me. Ooh, what do I have going on? I don't know. The timeline has been updated. We've talked about that. I mentioned the interactive map /timeline. That'll be updated probably sometime later this year. So people can look out for that. I think that's super cool to kind of merge the timeline and the art in a kind of visual way. So I'll be excited to get that updated when we're ready to. In the near term, I am on a Shardcast episode covering the history of Roshar, post what we know Wind and Truth. That probably will be out when this episode is up. So you can go check me out there and give that episode a listen. I think we had a fun deep dive into sort of the piecing together all the history of Roshar, what we know now.
Yeah, for sure. We've got one of those episodes in our future as well.
Probably more than one. So thank you again so much for being here. Thanks to all of the listeners and all of our patrons. Jofwu, when we end each episode, we like to say the first ideal and would love if you joined with us.
Sure.
Brooke, can you take us away?
Until next time, life before death.
Strength before weakness.
Journey before destination.